Let's get to the news, guys. President Trump announced his national security strategy yesterday. Speaking at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center in Washington, Trump outlined his world vision while calling out what he sees as the failures of past administrations.
For many years, our citizens watched as Washington politicians presided over one disappointment after another. Our leaders in Washington negotiated disastrous trade deals. Our leaders engaged in nation building abroad while they failed to build up and replenish our nation at home. They undercut and shortchanged our men and women in uniform. They failed to insist that our often very wealthy allies pay their fair share for defense. They neglected a nuclear menace in North Korea, made a disastrous, weak, and incomprehensibly bad deal with Iran. They surrendered our sovereignty to foreign bureaucrats in faraway and distant capitals. Our leaders drifted from American principles. They lost sight of America's destiny. America is in the game, and America is going to win. Our strategy advances four vital national interests. First, we must protect the American people, the homeland, and our great American way of life. This strategy recognizes that we cannot secure a nation if we do not secure our borders. The second pillar of our strategy is to promote American prosperity. For the first time, American strategy recognizes that economic security is national security. The third pillar of our strategy is to preserve peace through strength. We recognize that weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unrivaled power is the most certain means of defense. Fourth and finally, our strategy is to advance American influence in the world. But this begins with building up our wealth and power at home.
So, Richard Haass, break it down for us. What was different and what was borrowed from past administrations?
What he tried to do is differentiate himself from a lot of his predecessors. No talk about transforming the world to bring democracy to the Middle East. Right. Wasn't talking about bringing China or Russia into the international community at all. Very, very tough language on that. Big emphasis on protecting the homeland. Close it off to immigration, close it off to refugees, not interested, as you sense, in trade. The biggest problem, though, was not all that. The document itself was actually not that far out. It's the gap between the document and his own foreign policy. So you have things like saying, national debt is a grave threat to the United States, but now today we're going to pass a tax bill that's going to exacerbate it by at least $1.5 trillion. It talks about the importance of diplomacy and multilateral institutions. This is an administration that got out of the Paris Agreement, boycotted the migration meeting, is gutting the State Department. It talks about how important it is to be tough on Russia. Talks about Russia as a revisionist power, talks about the danger that Russia poses by interfering in the domestic politics of Western countries. Needless to say, that's somewhat at variance with the policy of the Trump administration. It's very tough on China, but the first thing this administration did was what? It got out of TPP. That was the principal instrument it inherited in order to push back against China's reach in the region. So again, the document itself is not that far outside the foreign policy mainstream. The problem is the gap between Donald Trump's document and Donald Trump's foreign policy.
Elizabeth, what was your takeaway from the president's speech yesterday?
I would agree with Richard. What's striking is, as it was very tough on Russia along with China, but as you notice in the president's speech, he was not tough on Russia in the speech at all. In fact, he praised Vladimir Putin for helping, for calling him the other day, because the CIA had helped Russia thwart a terrorist attack in St. Petersburg. So, and again, he made no mention whatsoever of Russian interference in the 2016 election, even though the document itself does. So what we're seeing here is a document, as Richard says, it's pretty much in the mainstream. It's a very dark document talking about the return of great power competition, which was absent from other documents with previous administrations. But Trump's speech and his tweet-driven presidency does not really coincide with the policy in the document.
So, Juan, if you listen to that speech, the president went through a litany of mistakes the previous administration, previous administrations has made, neglecting North Korea, the Iran deal, on and on and on. What fundamentally is different about what he said yesterday in terms of an American foreign policy view from the previous administration?
Well, I was there yesterday and listened to the speech, and I agree the speech was a bit of a disconnect from the document itself, but I think it's an ambitious document itself, and part of what's different is this notion that you do have two great powers trying to rewrite the rules of the international order, and I think that is fundamentally different here in that the president's trying to lay out that we are in a grand competition militarily, economically, and the document tries to then lay it out. One thing that's different here, and the president pointed this out, is looking at economic security broadly. This idea that China, Russia, and other powers, state and non-state, are actually trying to undermine U.S. influence and power. And so that's why the document gets into things like energy dominance, the protection of the innovation base, protecting intellectual property, integrating the protection of infrastructure, right? And so all of that, I think, is a much more aggressive tone. Richard's absolutely right, though. How does that mesh with what's happening, and how do we advance U.S. interests when it appears to the world that we're withdrawing in many ways from the climate deal, from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and is the world ready to deal with us on a transactional basis? So the president talks about we'll deal with the world, but it has to be on fair terms. You know, if we're advancing U.S. interests, if we're trying to push back against great powers, if we're trying to deal in the cyber domain as well as the physical domain, you need allies, you need friends. You can't alienate them. You can't alienate South Korea and Mexico while you're dealing with hard problems.
Well, that's exactly right, because this is a very dark view of the world. The most interesting statement is it basically gives up on the idea that's really shaped American foreign policy now for 25 years, that we're going to build a post-Cold War world with Russia and China. Very dark, but it then, in a funny sort of way, unilaterally disarms. We're not, you know, because what we've done, again, is we've added all sorts of conditions to our alliance relationships in Europe and Asia and so forth. So again, there's a disconnect. But it's a very dark view, but it doesn't make available to ourselves what we need to do in order to implement a strategy to push back against the China and Russia that this document describes, which, by the way, is not the China and Russia that Mr. Trump talks about. Right. He constantly talks about his relationships and how good they are with these leaders. And the document poses a very different view. So you wonder, is this the document of the interagency community, of H.R. McMaster and others? To what extent is this the document of this president? I say one other thing, Joe. I've worked for 4 presidents. I've never been in a meeting in 4 administrations where someone said, we have to do this or we can't do that because of our national security strategy. So I don't think necessarily this is a document that's a guidepost or the Bible for this administration.
It's like party platforms at conventions. Elizabeth, though, this just comes at the worst of all possible times. We've been talking about a rising China now for 20 years, but we are seeing it every day. The Chinese, first of all, clamping down at home. At the same time, they're doing everything they can to extend their power across the globe with open arms, trying to get as many trading deals with as many of their allies and adversaries as possible.
And well, but as we've said, but the president has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was our principal vehicle for challenging China in Asia, and we have now ceded a lot of territory to China. I also think it's very interesting in this document, and there's no mention of climate change, which is completely against the Pentagon policy, which sees climate change as a real national security threat around the world. Instead, there's talk about energy dominance, which Trump believes in. So again, it's very odd they came out with this so early. Usually administrations wait a couple years before they pull something like this together, and usually the president does not himself announce it. But we're told that Trump looked at the document, got very excited about it, and wanted to speak about it. And so that's what we have yesterday.